One of the scarcest commodities in politics is authenticity. And Trump is very authentic.
Is it better to be authentically bad than to be inauthentically good?
Well, that's a very good point.
Donald Trump has gone on Truth Social to say now Ukraine should not just win this war, but win back the territory that Russia has already started to take.
Trump said in his own speech, peace is not achieved by strongly worded letters, rather by action. Well, he's action man. Now's the opportunity for him to do it.
Hello and welcome to TrumpWorld, this time from New York City. I'm Matt Fry.
And I'm Anushka Astana. We're both here in the city that never sleeps. Both of us not sleeping quite enough, I think it's fair to say. And New York City is, in a way, closed down for world leader convoys to shoot through, which is why I just had to run through Manhattan to get here to be with you, Matt.
I think this is something like my 12th UN General Assembly. It always comes at this time of year in September when it's still nice and warm. And all you really want to do is sit outside on the pavement and have a beer and a cup of coffee. But then you see everything is about barricades and police roadblocks. And there are these delegations from all over the world with their entourage and their clipboards and their Secret Service agents walking through the city. But because of Trump mainly, whenever he shows up, it's entertaining or alarming. And today was definitely alarming. I think he gave the most brazen speech I've ever heard him give, especially to this crowd, insulting his hosts, the United Nations. And remember, he, of course, denied visas to the Palestinian delegation, all 32 of them. They couldn't even show up, even though the recognition of Palestine was a massive issue in this General Assembly. And he then had some bilateral meetings, and one of them was with President Zelensky. And he came out of that meeting and said something he hasn't said at all since he took over, which is actually that Ukraine is in a position to take over all the territory it's lost to Russia, changing his tune completely. And then astonishingly, he put this all out on social media. He said at the end, and good luck to you both. I think to him, all of it, it's not quite a joke, but it is sort of a game.
Well, it definitely feels like it's a game show wherever he goes. Right back to when he dressed down Zelensky in February in the White House, and his final kind of thought is, this will make great television. He's clearly always thinking about this. And look, that speech was extraordinary. We're going to go through it with our guest later on, the former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who has been up there himself and who has had many clashes with Donald Trump as well. But yeah, before we do, it is kind of extraordinary to think that he would put that out on Truth Social. And also in it, he talks as if he's not part of NATO. He has this line where he basically says, yeah, we'll just keep giving weapons to NATO and they could do whatever they want with them. And in terms of like the position we're at, we have a situation where he invites Vladimir Putin to Alaska. He rolls out the red carpet, literally, for the Russian president. He gets a bit annoyed when the Russian president suggests that he wants to take the whole of the Donbass region in order to try and do a deal. But the reality at the time, Matt, and I'm sure you've talked to a lot of people about this. I've spoken to, I asked Keir Starmer about this when he was here in Washington, D.C. If you ever ask them about whether or not Ukraine is going to have to give up the land that Russia has already seized, no leader would say that they'd have an answer on that. They'd say it would be up to Ukraine, but privately behind the scenes, the assumption is that that land is never going to be won back militarily by Ukraine. So the idea that suddenly Donald Trump would come in with this statement, which would require a huge offensive from Ukraine, presumably would require a massive, extra arming by Europe and America, just seems mind-blowing, but also makes you question how seriously to take whatever the president is saying.
One thing that always intrigues me about Trump is that whenever he does one of his many pronouncements or signs a declaration from the so-called Resolute desk that was put into the Oval Office by Abraham Lincoln, there's not a single shred of paper on that desk. I don't think he ever reads a single briefing note. He might be told stuff, maybe his briefing is watching Fox News, but I don't get the impression that he does any homework whatsoever. There's not a shred of evidence of that he knows the facts, that he's got the context, that he knows a little bit about the history. And I think that's important especially in the case of Ukraine, because this isn't about land. It's about, Ukraine surviving as an independent sovereign nation state. And I still don't think he really understands that. And that must be incredibly frustrating for someone like Zelensky, if he pins him up against the wall at the United Nations in some dreary briefing room and tells them the way it is and what he would like. And Trump agrees. But again, does he actually remember any of that stuff? Does he act on it? The one thing that comes up, and people I spoke to this week have pointed, who worked with the administration have pointed this out, in a very serious way. It's all about Donald Trump. He is the change maker. He is the rainmaker. He's the peacemaker. So when Donald Trump thinks that things aren't going his way, that's when he gets upset. So when he talks about Vladimir Putin, he repeatedly says, I will change my policy here. That doesn't even use the word policy, but I will change what I've been doing or saying because he has let me down. This is not about values. This is not about the future of the Ukrainian people. This is about him and his ego getting bruised, and therefore he will act in a certain way. It's always about him. And that's what we saw at the United Nations today. Here is this one man appearing in front of this crowd. And, they're not all model Democrats, right? I mean, some of them are dictators and some of them are, democratically elected. But in that rambling, rasping litany of grievances and pettiness and that whole thing about they never gave me the contract to renew the plumbing at the UN headquarters back in the 1980s. He brought that up. He spent more time talking about the terrazza floor and the parquet floor and all that nonsense in the UN building. And it's not particularly nice. He's got a point there. But still, he talked more about that than he did about nuclear weapons. I mean, it's astonishing.
Yeah, but it is worth just going through the different bits of the speech that were quite, arguably could be quite consequential if actions actually match words, and there isn't necessarily evidence on each part that they will. On the UN, he was incredibly critical of the UN in there. He repeated his claim that he has ended 7 wars.
In 7 months? It's almost biblical.
I think if you go and speak to each of the countries individually, they don't disagree. There's much more nuance on a lot of that. But then he comes out, he speaks to, the UN General Secretary, Antonio Guterres. He says, America is 100% behind the UN. Obviously, on Russia, he was critical of European countries for buying Russian oil, including some of his own allies. But then he comes out and he takes a much tougher stance on Russia. On climate, I mean, that is the strongest attack on climate change and those who want to tackle the climate crisis that I've ever heard. He essentially called it a con and a hoax. There is a slight shift here, I think, this week in the UN that we've seen in terms of the way everyone's dealing with Donald Trump. We have seen leader after leader suck up to Donald Trump because they know that, America's still really important on loads of these issues, and they think that's the best way to his heart. But on the issue of Palestine, we have seen something quite different. And I think, the fact that we have seen so many countries, including the UK, and it is symbolic, obviously it is symbolic rather than leading to practical action at this time, but to basically stand against the US and say they're going to recognize Palestinian statehood did feel like quite a moment in terms of where the UN was going. And it did feel to me like the US was taking an increasingly isolated position when it came to that.
Which is really, I think, quite alarming because the US on this particular issue, together with Israel, has decided, to go, down the yellow brick road to eternal war, I think. I mean, Trump isn't really that interested in ending the war in Gaza. He says that he is. He's interested in bringing the hostages home, and then he might do something more dramatic about ending the war. But what we've seen, the evidence suggests that he is wholeheartedly behind Benjamin Netanyahu's war on Gaza. And he is wholeheartedly behind whatever the Israelis are doing in the West Bank. He has done nothing to stop the Israelis crossing any number of red lines in both those cases.
And should Netanyahu say he's going to annex the West Bank,
I don't think he'll stand in his way.
Yeah, all the signs are that America won't do anything about that. I mean, this speech in which basically Trump, attacked every kind of group that you could imagine, even if afterwards he was more conciliatory, comes after a kind of extraordinary couple of weeks in the US with the killing of Charlie Kirk, the political conservative activist who was very, very close to Donald Trump. And one of the things that I just thought was so striking was at that memorial, Charlie Kirk's widow basically said, I don't hate the person who did this.
I've forgiven him. She's a good Christian.
Yeah, she's, you respond with love. And Trump comes up and basically says, yeah, I hate my opponents. And this is so different, Trump 2.0 to the first time round, because he knows what he wants to do and he is taking action. He's clearly quite driven by Stephen Miller, who's an absolutely key advisor, his deputy chief of staff. And, in the days since then, and practically it's very difficult to do this. I can just explain why, but he says he's going to label Antifa as a terrorist organization. Now, just to be absolutely clear, Antifa doesn't have a leadership. It's a movement. It's a left-wing movement. And how you practically go about doing what he's saying would be very difficult to see. But he is taking action. And some of it feels like pretty authoritarian action to crack down on free speech from the left, for example, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's killing, and it feels like a very, very momentous moment for the US. It is time to bring in our guest to explore all of that. Malcolm Turnbull, former Prime Minister of Australia. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you.
You've been up at that stage, and you've also presumably watched US presidents at that stage. Did that speech surprise you?
Well, nothing really surprises you with Donald Trump. He's one of a kind. But it was not only very long, it was very eccentric. All of the discussion about the broken escalator and the teleprompter were a bit odd. And, the savage attack on global warming, on the science about global warming, the savage attack on other countries about migration. I mean, look, not everything he says is wrong. I mean, interestingly, when I spoke to the UN, I think in 2016, I made some points about controlling unauthorized migration, which, I guess overlapped a bit with what Trump said. Obviously, I was much more measured, but I did make the point that if you want to maintain support for a multicultural society and in your own country, you need to be able to control your borders. And so, not everything Trump says is wrong.
I was stood right by him when he went onto that escalator, and he looked absolutely furious because basically he and Melania got onto it and then it immediately got stuck and he had to walk up. And as he walked up, people were saying, oh, he's fuming about all of that.
Yes, generally it's better not to, make that as obvious as he did, but there you go. That's him. I mean, one of the scarcest commodities in politics is authenticity. And Trump is very authentic. He gives the impression that he's saying what he thinks. That doesn't necessarily mean he'll think the same thing from 1 hour or 1 day to the next. But he comes across as authentic, and I think that's one of his political strengths.
Even though he's often authentically bad. Is it better to be authentically bad than to be inauthentically good?
Well, that's a very good point. I think politically, you're better off being authentic, but if you are authentically wrong and authentically bad or crazy, ultimately people won't vote for you. But inauthenticity and these politicians that sound like they've been to politician school and they're trying to be somebody else, ultimately people see through that. And, particularly nowadays, politicians do so much media. Trump does more media he's done more media this year than the last 3 US presidents, apart from himself, probably did in their whole terms. But, in a country like Australia, or indeed in the UK, where you have to answer to question time in Parliament, you're constantly, doing interviews and engaging with people. If you do sound like a political stiff, then people will see through it.
I just wonder, because I talked to one of his people today and they said, well, it may have sounded like a very insular speech, a very nationalistic, nativistic speech, but he was addressing his crowd at home. When you're on that stage, when you are on that stage, surely you're talking to the audience in front of you, not the audience, in Kentucky or Milwaukee, or in your case, it would have been, I don't know, New South Wales or the Hunter Valley,
all politics is local. And so every politician has got an eye on their domestic electorate. And Trump, very much so. So yes, you have, but obviously at the UN, you're seeking to engage a global audience. And look, I think Trump was seeking to engage them. He was telling them that, particularly the Europeans, that they're absolutely wrong on migration. So he was savage in his attack there. I mean, he's very much, and he and Vance both are quite shamelessly intervening in politics in Europe. I mean, it's perfectly clear that they support the nativist political movements in Europe, whether it's Farage in the UK or Marine Le Pen in France or the AfD in Germany, or Orban, of course, who's the Prime Minister in Hungary. Although,
without mentioning Orban by name.
Yeah, and the two countries that do are Orban, Hungary, and Slovakia, which both are run by populist right-wing governments that would be seen as quite Trumpian.
But just on this point that he really did go for Europe, he went for the UK, he went for London with stuff that wasn't true. I mean, it's suggesting to an audience potentially of millions that Sharia law is coming in London, for example.
Suggesting to an audience of billions.
Billions. But, we have seen at the White House, European leader after European leader come in and, I think the word sycophantic fits, yeah? They have gone out of their way to suck up to Trump, and privately their teams tell you it's because this is how he responds positively to things. And maybe afterwards they get their support on Russia, which we'll come back to. But just, does this show that sucking up to Trump doesn't work?
It absolutely doesn't work. And look, unlike most of the people who write about this, I've actually dealt with Trump. And I had a very good relationship with him, but I had a good relationship with him for one reason and one reason only, that I won his respect by standing up to him and having a blazing row with him at the beginning. It wasn't, it had some circumstances that caused that to happen, but it worked out to be very good because he is, Trump is a strong man, he's a bully, and when he encounters somebody who he can't bend to his will, he then negotiates and accommodates.
When you say you had a row with him, and I'm trying to picture it in my mind, were you actually shouting at each other? I mean, to what level did you raise your voice?
Well, it was a telephone call, and the context was in January 2017. He hadn't been president for very long. I had done a deal with Barack Obama to resettle asylum seekers in the United States that we were not going to resettle in Australia, and in return we were helping the Americans out with some asylum seeker issues in return. So it was a deal. I want to say it was a deal. It was a contract. It was an agreement signed, sealed, and delivered, as it were. And Trump was not going to honour that, and that so we had a big row about it, and I stood my ground and I said, we have an agreement with the United States of America and we expect you to honour it. And he got very angry. I mean, a lot of it, I'm not revealing any secrets, that most of the transcript of the call, not all of it, thankfully.
Which bit didn't they publish on the transcript?
There was some classic. So, well, I shouldn't go into it because there were some things that were quite classified.
Some F-bombs were dropped, some cuss words.
Whoever leaked them out of the White House, thankfully, there were some redactions, I'm pleased to say.
I was just going to say, you say you've had a good relationship with him, but I think you've called him chaotic, rude, abusive, and erratic, and he's called you weak and ineffective. I mean, it doesn't sound like quite a great relationship.
Well, that's recently, but when I was in office, after that, we had a good transactional relationship. I persuaded him not to impose tariffs on Australian steel and aluminium, for example. It was good. It was a very practical relationship. And interestingly, so that post he had on Truth Social having a go at me was because he'd seen me on Bloomberg earlier this year doing an interview in which I'd been asked how China would react to the trade war, and I said they will take advantage of it. They'll go on a charm offensive. They'll use it to, they'll seek to be the reverse of Trump. They'll be consistent where he's erratic. They'll be respectful where he's abusive and angry. And of course, that upset him. But in fact, it's exactly what's happened. So, having said that, as they say, the greater the truth, the greater the libel. So people are always upset when you tell them the truth.
It really struck me listening to the speech, which was more abrasive than any speech he'd ever given at the UN. And the bar for that is pretty high, to be honest. It struck me that, what was once an aberration and ignited laughter in the room and smirks, he is speaking to the gallery, even on European politics. I mean, we may have President Marine Le Pen in France based on an immigration ticket, or Jordan Bardella after the next presidential election. The AfD is doing really well in Germany, much better than it did when Angela Merkel was in power. Nigel Farage in Britain, we've talked about. I mean, he has, the stuff that he says today that sounds really offensive and abrasive often becomes tomorrow's reality. And do you think the world is sort of caught up with Trump's weird nativist view of politics?
Well, it's not entirely weird. I mean, I know this sounds odd. I don't want you to think I've suddenly become a Trumpian, but the bottom line, and I made this, we've been of this view in Australia for a long time, as you know, but the bottom line is, and I expressed this in my own address to the UN General Assembly, when I was PM, is that you have to control your own borders. Now, if you allow uncontrolled, or what the public regard as uncontrolled migration, which is essentially people smugglers, asylum seekers just flooding across your borders, you fire up the populist right. I mean, it plays into the hands of a Trump. Trump would not have got elected if Biden had controlled the southern border, for sure. It plays into the hands of Farage and Orban and the AfD and so forth. I mean, Angela Merkel is a great woman, great leader, but she made a colossal mistake in allowing 1 million refugees from the Syrian conflict zone to walk into Germany. A colossal, I understand the empathy and the compassion, but it's a massive mistake.
I've heard you say on exactly that perhaps that, for example, led to Brexit.
It certainly contributed to Brexit. There's no doubt about that.
And that argument, I can totally see that argument, the logic of that argument. But we also have a situation where Donald Trump was basically saying how outrageous it was that the UN itself would help these illegal aliens as they're coming across the border. You talk about compassion. There seems to be like the idea that people are actually seeking asylum, fleeing persecution, fleeing conflict. It's almost like we can't even have a conversation about that anymore. No,
you've got to have, look, the approach we've taken in Australia, and I mean, I understand Australia is unique, we're an island, we've got a lot of ocean between us and everywhere else. So I'm not suggesting that everything we do can be easily done elsewhere. But we have a generous humanitarian program, but we take the view that that anyone who comes here as a refugee comes here because they have been, identified and selected and approved and given a visa. Okay. And I made this point to Trump years ago in that notorious call. I said to him, our position is that if there is a people smuggler with a boat full of Nobel Prize winners, they still won't get in. And because we've just learned over the years that the only way you stop people smugglers is to deprive them of their product. There's a lot of stuff that Trump says that is, just fiction, really. But at the heart of it, this point about controlling your own borders is really critical.
But there are also different groups of people, aren't there? I mean, in Britain, as a case in point, 40,000 people on average, roughly, in the last few years, come over on small boats. And 750,000 people are brought in a controlled way through the official channels. And actually, by kind of muddying the waters and blurring the lines between one small group that's got a very powerful visual impact, because you have this idea of a kind of reverse Dunkirk of all these boats turning up. That's what gets people upset. And then you've got the other thing, which is actually quite official and above board, but still too many people are coming in.
Well, you're absolutely right. And can I just just to endorse the point you're making, the problem you've got is that if you are not in control of your borders, even though the number that come in illegally without a visa is very small, it undermines the public acceptance of the larger number that come in with visas.
On that interesting point, actually, was I was speaking to someone who's advised Biden on this very issue, Frank Sherry, and has been a lifelong kind of pro-immigration campaigner here in the US, who's been advising, in the UK and making really quite a similar point to yours, which is if you want the permission to be compassionate in a way, you also have to be, quite tough when it comes to particular borders, and particular the visuals of people being able to come in through the back door as people see it. One thing that really struck me in today's speech is Donald Trump says one thing. So he really, really, really laid out an extraordinary attack on the UN in the hall. And then afterwards, he sits down with Anthony Guterres and he says, the US is 100% behind the UN. On Russia, he criticizes European countries for buying oil from Russia. But then he comes out and he takes a much tougher stance. And I just want to ask you about that. Donald Trump has gone on Truth Social to say now Ukraine should not just win this war, but win back the territory that Russia has already started to take. How do you respond to that?
I mean, if he has woken up to the fact that Vladimir Putin is not his friend, and that the only way to deal with this war is to support the victim and help push back against the aggressor, then that's very much to be welcomed. But he has had in the past, and I've witnessed it firsthand, he has had in the past a sort of fascination, affection for Putin. And he owns up to it himself. Look at the red carpet welcome he gave him in Anchorage.
Was that a mistake, in your opinion?
Of course it was. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way for America to assist the end of the war in Ukraine is not to bully the weaker party, Ukraine, the wronged party, into submission. It is to use Americans' leverage, power, both economic and military, to force the Russians to back off. That's what they've got to do. And there's been this anxiety that, this will trigger a nuclear war in Europe. I think it's pretty clear that's not going to happen. Putin is pushing the edges of the envelope all the time. These overflights into Estonia and Poland are not accidents. These are, they're pushing the envelope. And so it's important that, Trump is unequivocally on the side of NATO.
Except he goes much further than any NATO leader other than him has gone today. When we ask Keir Starmer about whether or not Ukraine should get back the territory that has been lost, he would always say it's up to Ukraine what happens next. Most people privately think it's unrealistic that, Ukraine is going to be able to militarily push back.
Most people do. So I was surprised to read that. And it's quite at odds with everything the Americans have been saying to date. So there'll be a few heads spinning in Washington as well. Following the twists and turns of American policy on Truth Social is exhausting. But clearly we've got to welcome the fact that there appears now to be some greater solidarity with Ukraine. And if that is followed up with action, and remember what Trump said in his own speech, peace is not achieved by strongly worded letters, which he accused the UN of writing all the time, but rather by action. Well, he's action man. Now's the opportunity for him to do it.
The other thing that was interesting about the Truth Social was he talked about NATO as if he wasn't part of it. He was like, I'll give the weapons to NATO, do what you want with them.
Correct. I don't know. It's hard to parse and rationalize all of this, but the direction of travel seems to be in a more promising direction than it was yesterday. But who knows where it will go tomorrow.
He went further than I've ever heard him go before on climate, and he said some pretty outrageous stuff on climate in the past. He said it's a con. He said that, the carbon footprint is a hoax that's put out there by pretty evil people. He obviously has an obsession about wind power. Drill, baby, drill, we've heard before. When we have these debates around net zero in the UK, we can at least tell ourselves our overall emissions are not a huge part of what's going on in the world. This is the second biggest emitter in the world. How worried were you by what you heard?
Yeah, it was a very full-throated denunciation of the science of global warming. But, with all due respects to Donald Trump, it really doesn't matter what he thinks about global warming any more than it matters what he thinks about gravity. Physics cannot be denied.
Yeah, but it matters in as much as if he's unwinding every bit of climate progress in the US.
No, it absolutely matters in the US, but the reality is that I think the global trajectory towards clean energy will continue. The cheapest form of new generation of electricity is now in virtually every market in the world, renewables, solar followed by wind, backed up with pumped hydro or batteries. I mean, that is the cheapest solution without regard to the carbon cost. I mean, nobody in Australia, for example, and we have a lot of coal, nobody in Australia would build a new coal-fired power station regardless of what the emissions policies were. So I think that the tragedy of this is that he's essentially confirming and cementing the global leadership that China has on clean energy technologies. It's the leader on solar, it's the leader in wind, it's the leader with batteries, it's the leader with electrolyzers to make green hydrogen, and that is just going to become greater and greater. And, if the US thinks that it's going to, build its golden age on burning fossil fuels, it will be out of step with the rest of the world. But you see, Trump's confidence is such that he's quite prepared to say, I'm right and everybody else is wrong. I'm right and all of those scientists are wrong.
And it's worth saying you do have a stake in some of this.
I do, absolutely. I'm a renewable energy developer. I've been involved with the industry and, I've started some big clean energy projects while I was Prime Minister. But what I was simply going to say was, when you see the scale of the delegations there, over 500 people, big delegations from China, India, all around the world, not so many Americans, to be fair, but, the move to clean tech, to renewable energy is proceeding at an enormous pace and nowhere more so than in China.
You don't know what Donald Trump's obsession from dealing with him. You don't know what his obsession about wind is about.
He obviously doesn't like the look of them, wind turbines. But, I always say, well, I personally think they're very beautiful, but they're certainly much more attractive than an open cut coal mine or a power station, coal-fired power station, and they don't pollute.
We know that Trump doesn't really believe in multinational institutions, and the UN is top of the list. But by giving that speech today, do you think he was actually trying to kill the organization?
Well, he's not a believer in it, but Trump's view of the world is might is right, okay? And he makes no bones about that. The United Nations was founded to prevent might being right. It was a reaction to the horrors of the Second World War, and it was, designed to ensure as best could be done by international agreement that, the great will not be able to dominate the weak and trample on smaller countries' sovereignty as they see fit. And so, but Trump, that's not Trump's view of the world. He makes no bones about that. This is a guy who's threatened Canada, tried to coerce Canada into being the 51st state, said that he will get Greenland, a territory of Denmark, one way or the other. He sees the world, I think, more in a spheres of influence where his only counterparties are his equals in power, or which are firstly China and to a lesser extent Russia. although hopefully he's falling out of love with Vladimir. But so look, he has his views and his values are quite at odds with that inspired the foundation of the United Nations. And look, the United Nations has plenty of faults and flaws, but we're certainly better off with it than without it, because without it, you would have no global forum of that kind, and you would simply just have the rest of us would just be, struggling to survive with all of the decisions in the world being taken by one or other of the superpowers.
Malcolm, I can see why you want to make middle powers great again, because you represent one, but we have no idea who's going to be running these middle powers in a few years' time, and whether their interests will be aligned with Donald Trump and might is right or not. I mean, Farage in the UK, possible. Le Pen or Bardella in France. So the middle power thing may have a very short shelf life.
Yeah, but you see, the problem is, you may be. Let's assume you have a Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella becomes president of France after Emmanuel Macron. Let's hope it's somebody more centrist like Edouard Philippe. But let's say you do have a populist. They're still going to run into the same problem. They run into exactly the same problem because Trump is not spreading an ideology. It's not an ideology that purports to be universal like communism was. I mean, it is this, or indeed liberalism, economic liberalism purports to be. This is his message: is America first. And so whether you are the right wing or the left wing or the centrist president of France, you're still going to have a problem if the United States is run by somebody, whether it's Trump or a successor, whose view is that they will use this, whatever strength they have and whatever leverage they have over smaller countries, to extract advantage from them to the benefit of the United States. In other words, if dependence becomes a vulnerability to be exploited as opposed to something to be respected, then you're in trouble as a middle power, a smaller country, no matter the politics of your leader.
Just on what you were talking about there and what France has been doing, obviously Emmanuel Macron has taken a huge lead here on recognising Palestinian statehood. That has been quite eye-opening to watch so many countries stand up to the US on that point. But one thing Donald Trump said, which it was not a nice thing to say, but I did wonder if there was some truth to it, was he was critical of the UN because essentially it's a talking shop. He basically said they write a strongly worded letter and that's as much as they could do. And Palestinian statehood being one example of it, isn't there some truth to the fact that it is a bit of a toothless organization if it can't actually take action to change things in conflicts like that one?
No, I think that there's quite a lot of truth in it. I mean, firstly, it is a talking shop, but so is Parliament, so is the US Congress, so is a board of directors. I mean,
fair enough. Yeah, good point.
That's so what? I mean, the problem is that it does not have an army. It does not have the kinetic authority to enforce its decisions, and the Security Council, which is the executive wing of the UN, the General Assembly is really only advisory. The Security Council, which can mobilize global action, can only do so with the concurrence of all the permanent members. So any one of the 5 permanent members can veto action, and in terms of any action that would be seen as adverse to Israel's interests, the United States has been a reliable veto there. And they had the same problem in the Cold War. But there are plenty of flaws in the UN's system of governance. But if they're not prepared, if the major powers are not prepared to work together, then its effect is very diminished.
What I don't get, Malcolm, is that he's so isolated now in his position on Israel, as is Israel itself, and he really, really wants that Nobel Peace Prize. All he has to do is rein in the Israeli Prime Minister, tell him to stop doing what he's doing in Gaza, and he's the only one who can do that. Why on earth do you think he's not doing it?
There is a very strong political, body lobby of support in America for Israel.
It's divided. The so-called Jewish lobby is not a monolith. The people that are much more united in their attitudes towards Israel and what it's doing in Gaza are the Christian evangelicals.
I agree, but nonetheless, there remains a lot of support, particularly on the right-wing side of politics in America. But Netanyahu, who I know well, he's got. I think the majority of Israelis now take this view, and certainly most of his military leadership apparently all take this view, that the continuation of this war in Gaza is not achieving any military objective and is doing untold damage at a level of human suffering to the people of Gaza, to the Palestinian people. I mean, it's the killing, the devastation, the starvation. It's horrific. And if you want to look at it from Israel's own point of view, Israel is more isolated, has fewer friends now than it did before. I mean, there was massive sympathy for Israel after October 7, but that has now been largely dissipated. And, a very good old friend of mine, in the United States, Dick Armitage, said this to me. He died recently, sadly, but a year or so ago, Dick said that his generation in America was solidly supportive of Israel. He said he didn't think his children's generation were, but he said he's absolutely convinced that his grandchildren's generation were not. And so this is if support from the United States is a key factor for Israel, which it always has been, if they have lost and are losing younger generations, then that is building up a huge problem for them politically and strategically in the years to come. And I think that's where, Netanyahu has had some extraordinary triumphs. I mean, the action against Hezbollah, their various exploits, been considerable. I mean, they're offset by the utter failure of October 7, of course, which, at some point there'll be an inquiry into. But if in the long run you lose the support of American public opinion, then Israel would be very, very much diminished in terms of its ability to, withstand its critics and opponents, both internationally and regionally.
That was Malcolm Turnbull, and that is it for this week's edition of TrumpWorld. I'll be back in London next week. Anushka, you'll be in Washington, D.C., and we have no idea, speaking today, what Trump's world will look like in 7 days' time.
Probably quite dramatically different from now, if the past is anything to go by. See you next Wednesday.